Welcome to the WRAL Daily Download. I'm your host, Amanda Lamb. Less than 2 months after a WRAL investigation into the death of a second child in the care of Nash County's Department of Social Services, the state of North Carolina is taking over the agency's troubled welfare section. This is a rare and drastic action for the state to get involved in the operation of a county DSS. WRAL anchor and reporter Lena Tillett worked on this report and is here to talk about the latest developments in this very, very tragic story. Lena, welcome to the program.
Amanda, thanks so much for having me, and also for so closely following our investigation into the Nash Department of Social Services.
Yeah, it's a very important story, and you guys have been breaking news in this story. We're going to talk about some of the new information in a moment, but first, let's bring our listeners up to date. They may not know the whole story. We need to give them some context on what happened to these two children.
So, Amanda, I think at the core of maybe the similarity between the cases is a really painful question, which is, could the deaths of these two children have been prevented? So I have to give you a timeline because the details are important here, given really the extraordinary step the state took this week.
Absolutely.
Our whole investigation began back in February with the death of Crystal Lane. The 8-year-old and her 5 siblings were living with their grandmother. She was their guardian. And in December, her school had called Nash DSS and the Nash County Sheriff's Office because they said that Crystal Lane showed up to school with some really terrible injuries. The Nash County deputy who investigated the case, she told me directly that after interviewing Crystal and her siblings, that she, in no uncertain terms, told Nash DSS they all needed to be removed from the home. She said that they were not safe. She had interviewed the siblings. Again, there were 6 total, and the grandmother. And after those conversations, she knew that they needed to be removed from the home.
That didn't happen.
That recommendation happened in January. It didn't happen. A few weeks later, Crystal was tragically beaten to death, authorities say, by her grandmother. So that was so devastating to hear. Certainly, as we got the tip that Nash DSS was investigating, and we wanted to know, why didn't Nash DSS remove the children?
Because
what took them so long?
Yeah, and again, you've explained in your reporting that law enforcement was also involved in this, and they felt
absolutely.
the same way.
Law enforcement was very clear. The deputy, Macy Hasty, who was part of our investigation that aired in the summer, told me again directly that she told Nash DSS social workers the children needed to be removed from their home. So fast forward, we've been talking to social workers after February into the early summer. And we learned from former Nash DSS social workers that this had happened before with a baby boy named Chase Hilliard back in 2020. The former Nash DSS social workers told me that they warned leadership in the agency directly and repeatedly that Chase Hilliard should not remain in his mother's care. They said she wasn't mentally competent to parent, something that we were actually able to corroborate in a court affidavit from Chase Hilliard's aunt, who, reflected on her learning disabilities and said she read at a low grade level. And so the social workers told leadership the mom just wasn't competent. They even tried to work with her and tried to give her training. And even after that, the social workers again went to leadership and said, hey, she cannot care for this baby. But Nash DSS leadership again did not approve his removal. And just weeks before his 2nd birthday, he fell from a bed and then died just a couple weeks before his 2nd birthday.
And you learned about this in your initial reporting on Crystal's case, and then realized, hey, there is a pattern here. There is something wrong with this agency.
I think the insight from the social workers was key, though, in putting all these pieces together in our investigation, because they actually worked on the inside. They understood what the steps are to removing a child. And, the social workers are the ones on the ground. They're the ones investigating. And then after that, there's a process where they bring their recommendation to leadership within the agency. And they said they repeatedly brought the recommendation to remove Chase Hilliard from his mother's home, and the leadership just didn't approve it. And of course, we want to know why. But a year later, the mother was charged with second-degree murder because the medical examiner determined that the fall and his injuries were not accidental. So now you have a mother facing second-degree murder charges, and you have a baby that tragically died. So just absolutely heartbreaking situations. And, it raises all these questions about why Nash DSS isn't acting urgently in these cases that clearly demand it.
Absolutely. And as we talked about at the beginning of the show, the state has taken some severe action here, and we will discuss that after the break. Welcome back to the WRAL Daily Download. Lena, tell us about the letter from the state that has said, it is taking over the child welfare section of the Nash County Department of Social Services, which is a really unusual move.
It's unusual. It's unprecedented. And I say that because it's only happened 3 times. And it was also a very pointed letter that the state sent to county leaders. I've been a journalist now more than 10 years, and I haven't seen a letter that was this direct and this blunt in their assessment of how Nash DSS was handling these incredibly sensitive issues. So I wanted to read part of the letter to county leaders.
Please do.
Because
yes.
In addition to Crystal Lane's death, and the state also knew about Chase Hilliard's death after our investigation, though we know they were also, it's state law that they have to investigate any child death when it's coming in the care of a county agency. But they didn't know all of the circumstances that we were able to uncover through our investigation. In their letter, they even mentioned that there was another near fatality that they had to intervene with, and so last month.
That's a third case, obviously.
That's a third case. The letter says that NCDHHS followed up with an enhanced plan due to a near fatality and several serious abuse cases in August, where Nash DSS's lack of thorough safety planning and strong decision-making continued to leave children unprotected. Very strong language there. So that means that even after the Crystal Lane investigation, and I should say this because this is an important piece in terms of the timeline here. After our investigation aired about Crystal Lane in the winter and early spring, the state did its own investigation into Nash DSS. And it was a cursory investigation. They were basically just trying to see what types of patterns were happening within the agency. And even in that cursory investigation, they could see that basically systematically there was bad supervision and follow-up on some of the most sensitive cases. So they ultimately placed Nash DSS under a corrective action plan, and that happened in May. So that happened in May. They're under this corrective action plan. That means that Nash DSS was supposed to be taking these steps, and that the state would be kind of their partner in that and help them as they're trying to make these steps to improve their department.
But it wasn't enough, right?
Our investigation came out in July into Chase Hilliard. And then by September, the state came out with this extraordinary letter saying that they were taking over child welfare services. So there's
been a change, correct?
And then obviously what I just mentioned about this near fatality in August, it seemed like the state was saying, we have to now take over child welfare services because there is a major risk to children if Nash DSS continues to do this on their own.
And as you've said, this has only happened 3 times. The legislature gave the state power to do this in 2017. So this is very unusual. I know when we first talked about this story back in July, You mentioned that it really had a profound impact on you. I know you're a new mom, and you just said this really touched you in a way that other stories had not in the past. Just talk about that a little bit.
You know, thank you for asking that question. And I really wanted to remove my personal emotions as best I could from working on this story. Any story involving children, though, of course, is even more heartbreaking and even more touching. But there's a lot that we did not report on just the environments that these children were growing up in, what they had already survived, the difficult childhoods that they already had. Chase, again, dying just before his second birthday. Chase, or Crystal, by 8 years old. And, you know, these systems were supposed to protect the children when no one else would. And that's what makes it so difficult to grasp why Nash DSS wasn't acting with urgency. And I think that's what made it frustrating from a community standpoint as well. And it was also frustrating when you had Crystal Lane situation and then Chase Hilliard's death coming out, and learning that the same decision makers were in place during both of those Nash DSS investigations, and that those leaders decided to stay. County leaders did not demand them to step down. Community activists were saying that the leadership should step down, but at this point, they still haven't. And so the state is just, you know, again, making this extraordinary decision to take over child welfare services, at least temporarily.
Yeah,
and
it's hard to understand how nothing was done.
And I should also say that the social workers, I reached back out to them to ask them, you know, if they feel vindicated about the concerns that they had. I mean, they echoed a lot of the same things that were in the state's letter. They said that to me first, and then the state said that in their letter, that they were concerned that this could happen to another child. And those social workers said they felt vindicated, and yet they still have concerns because they don't know what this means fully now that the state is taking over, because the leadership is still there. They know that the state is going to be making the main decisions. There are also consultants that were brought into Nash DSS to help them with their supervision and their hiring and some of those issues. But they still have questions. I mean, this does not mean that now everything at Nash DSS
right.
is going to be working smoothly.
Absolutely,
there are still some systematic issues here, or systemic issues, I should say, that need to be addressed.
Absolutely. And, you know, going forward, I know this week state lawmakers in the House considered a bill that would give the state more oversight over county DSS agencies. It failed in the House. It's passed in the Senate. And I know that you talked about the fact that some language had changed. And so this isn't completely dead yet. There's a chance that this could pass, but it's just at an impasse at the moment.
Right. I mean, this is a whole other part here. There was a larger Senate bill, 625. It contained a lot of different things with the foster care system and adoption. And within it, there was this measure called Crystal's Law that came about after Crystal's death, and lawmakers really were trying to honor her. And they were essentially just trying to give the State Department of Health and Human Services better oversight over these county agencies, specifically when it comes to child abuse cases, because there's so many confidentiality laws, and you know, the state doesn't even have access to a lot of records that the county does, at least not until there is something awful that happens. So essentially what this law was trying to do was to give the state better oversight over county agencies. There are 100 of them, and they all kind of have their different vibes. They have their different structures. They run very differently, and they wanted to give the state better oversight. There was a House Republican leader who felt that the language was too broad, and they said that they reached out to county agencies and they agreed. Some of the language that got changed then was not agreed upon with Senate leaders. So it's not yet over Crystal's law. It just seems like right now it's being tabled. But I think ultimately what the state wants is, and I reached out to state DHHS about this to see if they support, what lawmakers were doing. And they said that they did, because they wanted to make sure that they could do whatever they could to try to better protect children.
Well, that makes sense. Well, Lena, thank you so much for your reporting and obviously the tangible change that your reporting has made, which doesn't happen every day. So that's an important thing. If you'd like to hear more episodes, please follow the WRAL Daily Download in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or just about any podcast app. Once you follow the show, you'll automatically get new episodes every weekday. As always, thanks for listening to the WRAL Daily Download.